Morning, everybody. How are we doing today? Today I want to discuss with you some trumpet players. Trumpet's such an interesting, emotive vehicle for the person who is utilizing that tool. It really drives home the player's personality fairly succinctly. Do you come across cloudy and milky and soft? Do you come across bright and sharp and aggressive? It really has a tonality that lends itself to displaying the artisan's template, mode, operandi, as they say, modus operandi. I love the trumpet. It's an interesting time for the trumpet in the 60s. Not something we realize necessarily, but the trumpet's falling out of use. And that happens to the trombone as well, even more so. In the 60s, most of the great trumpet trombone players in that era are established at earlier points. The 40s and the 50s, coming out of the swing bands into the bebop era. Gillespie creates another generation of kids after him. But that generation after Gillespie's kids, who come up, there's not a lot of cats who are just coming into the trumpet in the 60s. And we think that's kind of counterintuitive because of all the great Freddie Hubbard and Lee Morgan and, of course, Miles Davis. There's so many, Kenny Dorham. There's a lot of great players going on that wouldn't make us think the trumpet's falling out of favor, but it is. And there's really only a few kids that come along in the 60s, like a Woody Shaw. And Freddie Hubbard shows around in the late 50s. He's kind of in that cusp. And I think Clifford Brown's passing is some of that dynamic. The great leader was gone. I think he would have inspired more to play. Some of it, I think, it's a difficult horn to play. It's much more difficult. It requires a lot more intense practice than the saxophone. The sax is fairly easy to get your embouchure and your tonality established. And I played both briefly in school, so I'm not speaking from experience. But just from things I've read and from little comments I've heard, it seems like it's a much more difficult thing to master. And that a lot of these kids coming up in the 60s wanted to honk their horn like Coltrane and be able to just kind of step in and go. And trumpet doesn't really make allowance for that. It requires you to spend some time with her to get to know her. If you want to get to know my curves and my inners, you better get to spend a lot of time with me. Caress me, hold me, love me. And it's just a cool horn that it's kind of sad to see it falling into disuse. But such is the nature of genres of music. Guitar and electric bass and things that R&B used to be made from. Most of that stuff's not even present now in R&B pop music. So there's always this moving of technology, moving of the instrumentation behind what's happening at a time. And sadly, when you fall prey to new gimmicks, you often find yourself being very dated a few decades on. It's the people who like Adele, Amy Winehouse, who are still making stuff in that traditional sense. That traditional sense of drums and bass and the acoustic instruments. That stuff always stays timeless. It's the gimmicks of 80s engineering and production that makes it sound like the 80s. It's a very easy trap to fall into, but it does have the consequence of you becoming part of that sound. When you don't fall prey to new trends, you'd end up staying relevant eternally. So first of all, I want to talk to you about Lewis Smith. And Lewis Smith makes 2 records at Blue Note. And he's one of the most under the cover kind of Blue Note players. They show up late in the 1500 sequence, 1584 and 1594, so 10 titles apart. Just a wonderful player. And he does modern as well as he does some bebop fire. The next track has wonderful bebop undertones. Let me just show you that. It starts off just rolling, you know, it just goes fantastic. On this record is a great lineup, and I believe Sonny Clark is on this, if I recall. Yep, Paul Chambers, Art Taylor, and Charlie Rouse round that out. Outstanding stuff, great album cover. The first one has Buckshot LaFunk. For those of you who don't know, that's Cannonball Adderley's nom de plume when he can't use his real name for contractual reasons. Duke Jordan, Tommy Flanagan, Del Watkins, and Art Taylor. So both records have just outstanding lineups. Lewis Smith starts off early on with Basie playing with Sonny Stitt. He decides fairly early on to put being a professional musician aside and teach. And he goes to our T. Booker Washington High School in Atlanta. And I think that's a fairly black high school, if my memory serves. And decides he wants to dedicate his life to civil service and helping out the young generation, getting to know music. And then eventually he ends up at Michigan, or Michigan State, University of Michigan. He ends up leading the band jazz ensemble there and being a very prolific writer, composer. So he stays with music, but just not as a performer. I think he does come back later in his life and does a few recordings. But man, what a great player. It's interesting hearing him because he has a tone reminiscent of Armstrong at times, but also really reminds me of Dizzy Gillespie. Just a fiery virtuosity, a bright light is inside of his tone. Let's skip the sax player here. I love Charlie Rouse, but we're talking about Lewis Smith here. He's got all the brightness and the ferocity of even a Freddie Hubbard, incredibly dexterous player. He's probably more nimble even than Lee Morgan or Donald Byrd. And he actually sits in for Donald Byrd with the Horace Silver Group at Newport in 57 or 58. And from what I read, he was remarkable. And so not all of the greats in this music stayed in this music for a lifetime. And that's especially true for the white guys who moved on to television and film and all kinds of other aspects of the industry. A lot of those jobs weren't available to the blacks. And it does seem the few black jazz players who stepped away from the music, almost without exception, seem to end up as teaching the music to the young generation. And so Lewis Smith is a guy you need to seek out. He's just an incredible player. Those two Blue Notes are fairly tough to come by, especially the originals. But you can find Japanese pressings, which those both of are. And I guarantee you will love Lewis Smith once you dig into those. Oh, he was also, by some weird coincidence, the cousin of my next artist, which is the great Booker Little. Booker Little now is the guy that comes on the scene, and he has some big shoes to fill almost immediately. He's chosen by Sonny Rollins and Max Roach to replace Clifford Brown. And I think Clifford is first replaced, I think, by Kenny Dorham briefly. And there's someone else in there, I think, that filled that chair for a minute. But ends up becoming Booker Little's spot to fill. And Booker Little is dynamic. Incredible brightness. I would say he's probably on par with Freddie Hubbard. And he's a comet in the tail of the Clifford Brown comet. He's a bright player. We lost Clifford Brown very early. And we lose Booker Little even quicker. Booker's not long for this world. And so Max Roach plays with two of the best trumpet players in the business. And unfortunately watches them both pass very young. Booker makes a few records with Max that are very noteworthy. I think they're mostly on Emercy. And then he does 4 records that are kind of on his own. This is on United Artists, again a Japanese pressing. And I believe Booker Little, I can barely read that. George Coleman is on the piano, no, tenor saxophone. And then the piano was Tommy Flanagan, and the bass is Arthur Davis, and the drums is Max Roach. So he's playing with George Coleman here, which is pretty interesting. Coleman's a guy, this is 1960 or so, Coleman's a guy ends up playing with Miles, and Miles, of course, and him don't really jive, and it ends up being Wayne Shorter. Coleman is a great player who doesn't really get records as a leader to the late 70s. He was always content being kind of a side guy, playing in the shadow of other people, and he plays in some great groups over the years, but Coleman doesn't have a large body of work. He also makes this great record at the Time label, which was Bob Shadd's label out of New York. There's about a dozen or two great titles on Time, and this is one of the best ones. It's a great album cover. They love that white, black, and red motif for a long time. This is Booker Little with Julian Priester, George Coleman, Donald Friedman, Reggie Workman, and Pete LaRocca. It's an interesting lineup. LaRocca's kind of a blue note guy. Reggie Workman is all over the place. Donald Friedman's more of a piano player at Riverside. Coleman, Priester, and Little. Interesting stuff. And from my memory, 60-61 on Bethlehem. This is probably something one of the King Affiliates recorded. I don't think this is a Bethlehem recording. It just comes out on that logo because King now owns Bethlehem. But outstanding stuff. Very late in the Bethlehem sequence, also from the 1960 era. All 4 of these are from that same period. Booker Little out front. This is on Candid. Outstanding stuff. And boy, does the world need more Booker Little. But sadly, that was not to be the case. I want to talk to you about is also on Bethlehem, a great player by the name of Stu Williamson. Stu was one of those West Coast white cats that played with Stan Kenton, and that was a great orchestra with a lot of modern, compositional, challenging stuff. And these guys were all itching to step outside of that big band and do stuff on their own. Bethlehem, in the mid-56 or so, decides to launch a California branch of their record label, and they're hiring guys from the Kenton and Herman orchestras to record these fiery records. Some of the most up-tempo, bright players in the white West Coast jazz scene ended up recording at Bethlehem, 56, 57. Outstanding, 55 even. Outstanding stuff. I believe his brother Claude, the piano player, is on this, and Charlie Mariano's on this, along with Max Bennett, Stan Levy. So really an outstanding session. He makes a couple more sessions here at Bethlehem. This one here is probably from 55, maybe even 54 on a 10-inch Sapphire. I think Mariano's on this one as well, if I remember. And I'm a big Charlie Mariano guy. Charlie Mariano, Claude Williamson, Stu Williamson, Max Bennett, Stan Levy. So pretty much the same lineup. And then this one comes a little later, B55. Great cover. Fantastic sounds. We got Mariano with Bill Holman, Jimmy Joffrey, Stu and Claude. Leroy Vinegar and Mel Lewis now round this one out. And that's got to be a fantastic cover by the great Burt Goldblatt, and indeed it is. Most of those Bethlehem covers from this era were Burt Goldblatt, who is one of the most brilliant and ahead of his time graphic designers. He also shows up here, and he's kind of a co-build on the Jazz Band Ball here on Mode, and this is a great record. Mode's, of course, also on the West Coast label, and then, of course, also signing a lot of that same talent. Stu Williamson and Jack Sheldon kind of share the head billing on this one, along with Bob Enveldson on valve trombone, Don Fodgerquist also on the trumpet, Marty Peisch, Buddy Clark, and Mel Lewis in the rhythm section. This record's not too tough to find. These old modes are out there, not too expensive. Probably a little easier to come by than the Bethlehem stuff, to be honest. And this Pepper Adams Quintet, which comes 2 releases later than the last one, he also features in this one a lot. Pepper Adams, Stu Williamson, Carl Perkins, Leroy Vinegar, and Mel Lewis. So you see a lot of the same characters are playing on Bethlehem, playing on Mode, playing on Tampa, playing on Jazz West. These labels are all very much sharing the same talent pool, and with each signing, the next label has to get a different member of that group to be the leader. You can still use Stu, but now he's signed to Bethlehem, so we'll make him a sideman and we'll make so-and-so the leader here. And you see a lot of that in jazz over the years. Williams has got a nice tone. He reminds me of Donald Byrd, some thoughtful, swinging hard, always plays with a great deal of integrity and sincerity. You just feel that this is important to him. And Williamson definitely is some guy that should be on your radar as one of the great trumpet players of this era. Some of the other places where you'll find Stu Williamson, he's in a number of the great Shelly Manne records on Contemporary. He's on the Jazz Immortal session at Pacific. Like I said, he's on a lot of those Stan Kenton records. Terry Gibbs' Dream Band. He's also playing with Lenny Niehaus, which are also on Contemporary. The Howard Rumsey Lighthouse All-Stars. He's a part of that West Coast assembly. Bud Shanky's on a couple of his records. Zoot Sims Quintet. And Dwayne Tatro, another record on Contemporary. So Stu had quite a presence for a while there on the West Coast. The next guy I want to talk to is Howard Mcgee. And Mcgee has a long lineage. He jumps back all the way to the bebop era. And he's playing with those cats in Minton's. He's a part of that scene, working with cats like Monk and Max Roach and Charlie Parker. And he's just absorbing. And him and Navarro are kind of that second and third chair during bebop, kind of behind Dizzy Gillespie. And Navarro and Howard Mcgee were both more beboppers than Miles Davis ever was. There's a lot of hindsight when you look back and go, I don't think anybody would have predicted in 1949, 50, 51 that Miles Davis would be the most famous person in jazz 70 years from now. It's really kind of shocking the deeper you dig into the 50s and the 60s that this guy ascends in popularity primarily to the point where his ascendancy puts him on top. And I don't think that was something that anybody would have envisioned in 1950, 1955. And of course Columbia plays a large part of that, a big role with that. He's recording this here with Milt Jackson in 47, 48 for Savoy. It probably came out as 78s initially, and there's probably also a 10-inch of this. And then this is, of course, the 12-inch release, 12026. Probably comes out in early, mid-55, 56, possibly, with the great Milt Jackson. Vernon Diddle's on the piano, Percy Heath is on the bass, Jimmy Heath also plays sax, and then Joe Harris is on the drums. I love these old, early Savoy records, that beautiful logo, the beautiful black and white album covers. The graphic design element at Savoy was very underrepresented. They didn't really put a lot of effort into it. And oddly enough, it's that first 40 Savoy titles in the 12,000 sequence that are just black and white photos that to me are the most priceless, timeless covers that Savoy does. Savoy is quick to repackage a lot of this stuff in the 60s with more color photographs and different settings. A lot of those second covers to me are worse graphic design and more dated than these simple black and white photographs that the early Savoy pressings have. And when you're talking 12,000 sequence up to about 12055, those almost all have a second or third cover. And if you want to know what the first pressing is, the black and white is always going to be the earliest first or second pressings, and then the color covers come later. He also works with Blue Note in the 10-inch era, which again, the Blue Note 10-inch era is very different than the Blue Note LP era. They're licensing stuff from France, other labels, and reissuing it. They're taking old Sidney Bechet live recordings. This one looks like it might have actually been tracked by the Blue Note cats, but they haven't really established the Blue Note sound. They're probably not working with Van Gelder yet. It's mostly advertisements on the back. It's a nice little album cover. I'm pretty positive that Reed Miles isn't in the fold yet. Our farm runs on Tal Farlow's on the guitar. Gigi Grice is playing alto on the flute. Horace Silver, Percy Heath, and a fellow by the name of Walter Bolden is on the drums. Pretty tough to come by. Then Howard Mcgee also goes to Bethlehem. And Mcgee ends up being at Bethlehem in probably 55, 56 in that era. This is outstanding stuff. The Return of Howard Mcgee with a great Burt Goldblatt album cover that's really never going to go out of style. Second one here, B61, Life is Just a Bowl of Cherries. Another Burt Goldblatt album cover. Fantastic bands are playing on these. We got guys like Al Caiola, O.C. Johnson, Don Lamont, Herbie Mann. It's pretty fantastic stuff. He's got a really strong lineage. He's not as bright as the Hubbards and the Booker Littles or even the Lewis Smiths. He's a bit more of a melancholy player, a little softer in his tone. I wouldn't say he's Miles Davis, Chet Baker soft. He's certainly got a lot more fire than that. And again, he plays from the bebop school, so he definitely has the chops and play very up-tempo. But I feel like a lot of his sessions, he's always kind of a little bit more invested in mid-tempo and slow tempo, and that could just be my ear. He makes a third session at Bethlehem, 60-55, and the origins of the session are a little fuzzy to me. Really hard record to find, Dusty Blue. It's 60-55, so it's after King has already taken over most of the business operations at Bethlehem. It's got Howard Mcgee, Benny Green, Pepper Adams, Roland Alexander, Tommy Flanagan, Walter Bolden, and Ron Carter. Not really what you would consider Bethlehem guys, but not really guys you would consider to be King recording artists either. How this session comes about and exactly the details behind it, I'd like to know more. Maybe I should do a little more research on it, but some of these records are tough to find anything on. But it's a beautiful record. Absolutely gorgeous, great cover, and you get a great sense of what Howard Mcgee is about. In 61, he makes a couple records here for Contemporary on the West Coast, and this one happens to be with the great Teddy Edwards, the fantastic West Coast saxophone player who played back on Central Avenue with guys like Dexter Gordon back in the 40s. Back in that part of that great West Coast black jazz scene that was happening in the 40s. And this also record here, Maggie's Back in Town. Maggie was one of his nicknames. This is with Shelly Manne, Phineas Newborn, and Leroy Vinegar. Outstanding stuff on Contemporary, 3588, 3596. So both of those are towards the end of the 3500 sequence, and they're about to roll over into 3600, which the stereo versions are 7000, and those stereo versions become the only type of contemporary release not too long after this. Again, great Howard Mcgee, 14028. This is on United Artists. They do that little separate jazz imprint, the 14,000 sequence, 15,000 if it's stereo. Great album cover. Great players are on this. United Artists did a good job when they launched their jazz imprint of really signing some of the best talent. Ron Carter, Jimmy Jones on the piano, Art Taylor's on the drums, Larry Ridley and Dave Bailey are on some of these tracks. Really beautiful, some edges of melancholy. You forget at times how much of a bebop guy he was because of how comfortable he is playing in the modern context. Housewarming with Howard Mcgee and the Trailblazers. Just the Blazers, sorry. This is on Argo, 4020. And why this got on Argo? It's a little on the 4000 series and not in the 7000 series. 700, pardon me. I'm guessing it might be part because that Argo label was about to come to an end. Quintet was going to be the new name. They just put it on the 4000 sequence. Again, I don't really know. The Argo 4000 sequence is much more pop, piano, bar stuff. Not really the full modern development of jazz on the 4000 sequence. And somehow it ends up there anyway. So that's Howard Mcgee. And the last guy I want to talk to you about is probably the best known of this bunch to most of you, but still he's an underappreciated talent. And I'm going to put on one of my favorite records right now. That record right there is one of the toughest, most expensive Riverside titles that you have to find in the early 300 sequence at Riverside. It's brilliant stuff. Blue Mitchell is kind of right there. Lee Morgan, Donald Byrd, Blue Mitchell. And he's a Riverside guy first, then he goes to Blue Note and makes 5 or 6 or 8 titles there, more like 7 or 8. I love Blue Mitchell's body of work. I really do. I especially love his Riverside titles, which, like I said, they come first. And I'll show you those right now. This one here is actually an OJC pressing that I found sealed. I think I paid $40 for it, for a sealed OJC about 3-4 years back. Wilbur Ware, Curtis Fuller, Johnny Griffin, Philly Joe Jones, and sticker covers the other name, Johnny Griffin, Wynton Kelly. So you have a great lineup there. Just fantastic. Griffin, Mitchell, Fuller. So you have the hard bop Curtis Fuller on the trombone, the lightning fast Johnny Griffin on the sax, and then the kind of cerebral middle tone trumpet of Blue Mitchell. It's a nice range of tones from those players. And then you add Kelly, Ware, and Jones to the rhythm section. Great album cover and a really expensive record that's really hard to find at this point. That was followed up by this one, whose album cover I'm not as crazy about, but still a pretty cool cover. And Art Blakey, Benny Golson, Wynton Kelly, Paul Chambers, Sam Jones. Outstanding stuff. Outstanding stuff. And this is again one of those records that you'll pay pretty good bucks for. You can get into the couple hundreds real quick for a decent pressing of that. And the one we're listening to is 309. And like I said, this is one of my favorite Riversides. Blue Mitchell with Jimmy Heath, Curtis Fuller, Philly Joe Jones, Wynton Kelly, Blue Soul. And if you don't want to spend quite as much, this did get reissued on the Jazzland imprint, which is Riverside's budget label slash kind of more unique releases by not as established Riverside artists. Jazzland starts out purely as a budget label, but becomes much more than that pretty quickly. They repackaged this there with a similar, same photo, but this is different. They take some of the color and the beauty out of it. But you could probably pay half what you'll pay for this one, being the original pressing. Great cover. That contemplative nature, to me, is something you hear in his playing. Look at his photo. Look at his face. There's a seeking and a longing, an honesty. This isn't a guy that looks like he's going to be full of bullshit. He doesn't look like a guy that's full of flirtation and just talking about sex and money and Fuller in the background there. It's an interesting LP. One of the best in the Riverside fold, if you ask me. If you want to start Riverside with one of the best, that's one of them. He continues on at Riverside with Blues Moods, which is a smaller ensemble, Wynton Kelly, Sam Jones, and Roy Brooks. So it's pretty much just a quartet. And then there's a couple records with strings. Tad Dameron's behind that one. And then A Sure Thing, Blue Mitchell and Orchestra with Jimmy Heath, Pepper Adams, and Wynton Kelly. So maybe this one doesn't have the strings. The other one does the strings. This has a big band on it, though. Looks like Pepper Adams is on that. Jimmy Heath is arranging a lot of this stuff. This is a great record. I gotta listen to those first 4 more for sure. And this is Blue Mitchell, the Cupbearers. This is toward the end of his time at Riverside with the great Junior Cook, Cedar Walton, Gene Taylor, and Roy Brooks. So that's his Riverside work. And I'm going to show you quickly what he does at Blue Note. He comes to Blue Note with this, Step Lightly, and it didn't get issued. It didn't come out until Japan much later. It's got Joe Henderson, Leo Wright, Herbie Hancock, Gene Taylor, and Roy Brooks made the trip with him to Blue Note. And then The Thing to Do, Blue Mitchell, Junior Cook, Chick Corea, Gene Taylor, and Aloysius Foster. Great album cover. That's a Reed Miles classic right there. Great record. Fantastic sound. Down With It, High Heel Sneakers. The High Heel Sneakers was kind of a Boogaloo track. This is the point where the Boogaloo was sneaking into a lot of the Blue Note albums. Junior Cook, Chick Corea, Gene Taylor, and Al Foster on that one. Next is Blue Mitchell, Bring It Home to Me, with Junior Cook, Harold Mabern Jr., Gene Taylor, and Billy Higgins. And then we got two more here. Boss Horn, Blue Mitchell, with the track Millie, which is kind of also a Boogaloo track. Then Heads Up, Blue Mitchell. This is 4272. That's one of the last records Blue Note issued before they sold to Liberty Records. The sale happens like one or two titles after that. So it's at the very, very end. And after the sale, he makes a few more records for the new Blue Note under Liberty. And those are good records too. I just haven't picked them up. I've heard them. So that's 5 trumpet players that I think don't get enough light shed on them. Lewis Smith is as obscure as a Blue Note guy as there is. Booker Little, his career was so short. He was never on the Blue Note, Impulse, Prestige labels that get a lot of collectors noticing artists. He's on more of these in between the crack labels that are easy to overlook, which is sad but true. You gotta love Howard Mcgee. You gotta love all the stuff here done by Blue Mitchell. And who am I forgetting? Stu Williamson. Stu was a great player. So those 5 guys you should always look for. If you see their records, especially from the 50s into the early to mid 60s, never pass those guys up. All 5 of them come with the Jazz Shepherd seal of approval. These are great records by great players with great sidemen on very high reputation labels that are worthy of you collecting. Don't pass up Howard Mcgee. He's a great player that'll really suck on your heartstrings and make you feel something. And that's, in the end of the day, what we're all looking for is to feel something. There's so much in life that we can't feel, we can't relate to, we can't understand where it's coming from, what's driving, what's motivating it. And great art isn't driven and being motivated by money. And things that are driven and motivated by money always end up being shallow. Because they make as little offensive or as little challenging art as possible so that they can appeal to as many people and make as much money as they can. And that's a compromise. And it's a tough thing to do as a musician, as an artist, to choose between making a living or following your soul and speaking from your heart. And a lot of these guys who end up more obscure were the guys who didn't choose the path of going to the big labels, going to Verve to make it, going to Columbia to make it, ending up making stuff at Capitol and CTI. A lot of these guys stayed making records they wanted to make and dying in rather obscurity. And on some level, doesn't that make these guys more important than the guys who went to Columbia and ended up having long, successful careers, who still have these huge name reputations because of the marketing behind them? Good for them. But let's also pay attention to the guys that stay true to their roots, stay true to what they feel, and aren't willing to do a bunch of covers of Oklahoma and the West Side Story and all the schmaltzy film, television, Broadway theme songs. They didn't want to do that. They wanted to make the music they wanted to make. Not all these guys were offered, obviously, contracts by the big labels. I'm sure some of them would have jumped at the chance had they got it. But they never were given that, so they stayed making music from their heart and their soul because there was no need to compromise. You have to compromise on some level when you go to a bigger label because there's more money being involved. There's more risk now. And so they're going to manicure your career. They're going to prune what they don't want you to do, what they don't want you to play, how they don't want you to appear. The emoting process will be diluted and watered down because you're obviously forced into stuff you not necessarily want to play or feel, and it's hard to put your heart and soul into something when you feel compromised. It just is. So that's my episode for today. These are 5 trumpet players, 6 maybe, that we all need to pay more attention to. And when you see their vinyl, grab them. Like I said, they're all fantastic. Y'all be safe. Have a great day. If you haven't subscribed, please do. If you want to support the channel, please go to Patreon and pledge a few dollars a month. It's always appreciated, and it goes back into the channel and buying records and supporting what I'm trying to do here with a coffee shop that's going to open up and make my records available to people in the public. If you want to buy some great merchandise, in the description below, the Jazz Shepherd merchandise shop has some great stuff in it. And there's also a link to my podcast, which for the most part is going to just be the audio part of these episodes For those who want to walk around and listen to jazz being talked about, it's there for those people. Obviously, it's not for everyone. But y'all be safe. We'll talk to y'all soon. Peace.